Welcome to Yes Also. I'm Susie Barrett, and I am so thrilled about this week's guest, Chris Gethard. Chris is a UCB New York legend. He was a member of the Stepfathers, the star of the Chris Gethard Show, and he helped develop and write the UCB curriculum, which he talks about here. This episode is an absolute treasure trove of both improv lore and advice for doing better, simpler improv. Chris has a really beautiful way of explaining things simply and clearly, and I can see why he is such a sought-after improv teacher. I do have a tiny bit of housekeeping. We love this pod, and we're getting great feedback on it, so we'd love to keep it going. But in order to do that, we need a little bit more support. We do have a handful of subscribers, and we are so grateful to you. Thank you. But we need some more in order to keep this project going and in order to pay our guests for their time and, let's be frank, their brilliance. So we are entering a new era where we're going to break down our episodes into two parts. The first part of every episode will be free. That's what you're listening to right now. And the second part of every episode will be available only to subscribers. So in that way, we're still offering some great free content, but if you really want the full experience and you're able to help support the podcast, then you can go to yesalso.supercast.com and subscribe. And that's where you'll find part 2 of every episode moving forward, along with all of the Q&A episodes, bonus episodes, improvised scenes, and all the other fun content that isn't on the free feed. As a subscriber, you can also be added to our close friends list on Instagram, and we will let you know our guests ahead of time so you can submit questions to ask them directly. Go to yesalso.supercast.com to subscribe and support the show, and we thank you in advance for helping us to keep it going. This is actually a great episode to kick off that new model because Chris and I talked for 2 full hours. So after this part, you have a 45-minute part 2 waiting for you at yesalso.supercast.com. And that second part is where we really get into the nitty-gritty nerdy stuff, like doing better scenes. Okay, enough preamble. Let's get to Chris Gethard. Chris Gethard, welcome to the podcast.
A joy. I've been going down a very dorky rabbit hole of listening, and I love it. And it's wild for me because I feel like you're making a podcast where I get to hear people I am either well connected to or tangentially connected to, like, tell the story of my adult life. It's been wild.
Yeah. What sort of themes or things have resonated with you or have been ahas for you?
It's just to explain what I mean. I'm like, I'm listening to John Ross Bowie's episode of your show, and he was the first guy who ever mentored me when I showed up in New York as like a literal teenager at UCB New York. And then I'm listening to Will Hines, who I was on so many teams with and who helped me build my show that became my TV show. And like Will's telling you stories about being at shows I was also at that I'm also like, I was there, talk about this part of it. And then, Phil Jackson, Sarah Claspel, who I wound up teaching in classes and got to see them grow. And then listening to you talk to Craig Kakowski, who when I was a college kid, I used to drive to Chicago and watch shows, and I saw him do they called it Inside the Improviser Studio, where I'm like, I heard him do something like this 25 years ago on stage. And then like Ithamar, I just listened to Ithamar, who I don't know and have never performed with, but then we were out, I did a disastrous run at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2022. And one of the bright spots, you go out to that festival sometimes, and I went in 2016, it went great. And then I had a nightmare of a time in 2022. And one of the bright spots is you meet people who come up and it's like, hey, like, I'm also buddies with Peter Gross. And then you start to realize, oh, we have this shared common language.
Yeah.
So I'm like listening to you have all these conversations where I'm like, this is so many points on the line of my artistic life.
It reminds me of that feeling of, how you sort of, or at least this is my experience, I sort of only retain memories that correlate with photos that I have from my life, like photos from events in my childhood or in college or whatever. Those are the things that I end up remembering. And you don't realize that you're doing that until another friend opens their shoebox of photos, I'm old. And you see they have different photos that you are in, and it like unlocks other memories, or their pictures of the same event are different pictures. And you're like, whoa, wait. Right. Oh, and that guy was there? I don't remember that. So it kind of fills in the picture.
I know exactly what you mean. And sometimes you'll look at it and you go, oh, that was the stretch of life where I wore those sneakers. And it brings back these sense memories of exactly who you were at that time. And I will applaud you, because I'm like, there's a lot of nerdy podcasts out there, but I think yours is quietly building this thing that's sort of the oral history of the past 25, 30 years of this thing we're both a part of. And
that is
cool.
The goal. Yeah. I feel like I get to be one of the Fraggles and Fraggle Rock who gets to go out and talk to the trash heap and get all the wisdom and the lore, you know.
I'm happy to be a part of the trash heap.
Yes. So there are so many places we could start, but my interest was piqued when you just said you were a literal teenager starting UCB in New York. How did that happen? And how old were you?
I was 19 when I turned 20 during my level 1 class at UCB. And this was the year 2000.
Okay.
So I got there not close at the beginning. There's that whole solo arts wave of people that were at that like 5th or 6th floor walk up. I never went there. But I started at UCB within a couple months, maybe even weeks of when they opened their first theater on 22nd Street. And I was a college kid who started taking a train in from New Jersey. And it was wild.
How did you find out about it?
That was nuts. Basically, I had a teacher in high school who sort of saved, you know, you don't want to be melodramatic, but pulled me aside and was like, take my drama class. And I was like, that's not really my thing. And she was like, well, you're like kind of a wise ass and kind of standoffish, but I think you might be talented. And she had me do her drama class and made it all improv games, and later told me that was not her regular curriculum. She shifted it for me. And it's kind of saved my life. Like not to be melodramatic, but like a lot of people I grew up with wound up not okay. And I sometimes feel that guilt of like, how did things turn out pretty comparatively, like remarkably well for me? And a lot of it was I had one teacher who gave a shit.
And the answer is freeze tag.
There you go. Like strangely enough, big part of the puzzle. So yeah, I went to Rutgers after that and wanted to get into improv so bad. Made sure the college I went to had an improv group, because back then, late 90s, early 2000s, that wasn't a guarantee.
Right.
So I made sure they had this little short form group and auditioned my first semester, didn't get in. Second semester, didn't get in. Made my email address was improv@eden.rutgers.edu, because I was like, this will be my thing. And then you were unable to change your email address back then through the university. So I was like sadly getting rejected over and over again. And then finally got in my sophomore year, and it made me so happy. And I was not a happy person. I was a very, very angry and sad kid. And that made me happy. So I knew I wanted to keep it going. I was like, the summer was about to hit. Was part of this group. Took to it pretty quickly. And I was like, man, this is kind of the one thing I have going that's making me feel awake. And I went on the website for Chicago City Limits, and I was like, okay, this is pretty clear what this is. Like, this is the games like I've been playing with my group at college. Asked them for info, and like right away they mailed this brochure to my house. Here's how it all breaks down, the levels, what they cost, who the teachers are. They had a teacher at the time named Danny Glover, who was an improviser, and I thought it was Danny Glover from Lethal Weapon. I was like, that's insane. You can take classes from Danny Glover? Turns out he's just like another improv guy. And then UCB, as Will mentioned on his website, his episode, the website was terrible. Truly terrible.
I've got to get on the Wayback Machine and look at it. Have you ever played around on that internet
I haven't
tool?
checked. Yeah, I know the Wayback Machine is great. I don't know if that old UCB website is there, but I'll never forget. It was like a series of random squares. It's completely unmarked. Some of them were links, some of them were not. So you had to like hover your mouse, and it would be like, this one leads you to shows. and then this one leads to nothing, and then this one leads to classes, and they're the only description of their classes was like, we'll teach you guerrilla fighting techniques and spit takes. Like, it was a bit.
It was all a bit.
It was all a bit. And I was like, I just have a feeling this is where I have to be. I never went into the city to see shows at either place. I was just like, I just have this gut instinct, get to this place. Never saw long form, didn't even really know long form was a thing, and sent my $25 deposit check in. And Bowie hates when I tell this story, but I was like a little punk rock kid in Jersey and used to listen to his band, Egghead. Bowie was the singer and bassist in this band called Egghead, and they put out this fanzine called Go Metric that was this super funny music fanzine. And he called me up. I was 19, and he was like, "Hey, I'm so sorry to tell you, like, our level 1 class this summer is booked up. So you gotta wait till the fall." And I was like, "Oh, I'm a college kid. If I have to wait till the fall, I'll actually have to wait until next summer." And he's like, "Sorry." And which is so funny to think that there was a stretch. Like, I joined in a stretch when it was like, the level 1 class we have coming up is full. Like, right, that was the demand.
Yeah, we have room for 16 people in all of New York. Yeah.
So sorry, man. And he was like, "Yeah, nothing I can do. Get back to us next summer, blah, blah, blah." And I just very randomly was like, "Hey, you said your name's John Ross Bowie." And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Are you the same guy from Egghead?" And he's like, "You know Egghead?" And I was like, "Yeah, man. Like, I've listened to your record all through high school. I read Go Metric fanzine. Like, I love you guys. I've seen you play live a couple times." And he just paused and was like, "Okay, so your class starts on Sunday. Here's the address." And he snuck me in. I was the 18th, I think the 17th or 18th person in the class.
Oh my God.
And he snuck me in. And I give him so much credit. He hates it. He's constantly like, "Stop trying to credit me." But I do sit there. I go, if I had to wait another year, I was actually on the last Harold team that was just, "Hey, you're good. We'll give you a shot. So jump up."
Before it got really competitive and auditioning.
I was put on my first team. It's called the Joe Ross Tribe. And then after that, you had to audition. And me at the age of 20, the anxiety levels for an audition would have been through the roof. So I do really think that he got me started a year earlier than I would have. And that's how I found it. It was a combination of punk rock and nepotism and wanting to not be depressed and keep doing comedy.
Isn't that wild? But what a piece of affirmation that you found your people. That like the person calling you about this thing that you've found that's the only thing that has so far brought you joy also turns out to be the lead singer, not just a fan of the same music of you, the lead singer of a band you love. with
a very distinctive name. Like, he always was listed as John Ross, and I thought it was Bowie.
Yeah.
But when he called me and said John Ross Bowie, in my head, I'm like, that's how you pronounce that? And secondly, like, this has to be the same guy. And I think the idea of UCB New York back then being like the punk rock theater, the CBGBs of comedy, that became a little bit of like a media thing or branding, but there was a lot of crossover. There were a bunch of people from the actual punk music scene that were Brian Husky had a background in music, Dynamo, John Bowie. Like, there were a bunch of punk rockers, and I saw that shared DNA. So me, as someone who had been going to punk rock shows, and that was previously kind of the only scene that made me feel like I could be myself.
Yeah. I mean, even the way that you describe their website is punk rock. It's like, yeah, we're not sellouts. We're going to kind of put a bit description and you can figure it out and come do our class that's either, a 6th floor walk up or in the basement of a strip club or, it just, it always did kind of feel like, and a lot of those shows, I wasn't a part of like early New York, obviously, but even when it came to LA in 2005, those early shows were like very, especially the late night shows, very edgy, very challenging, very like, we're just going to do this and fuck it. And like someone's going to pee on stage and,
I never got totally into the dirty stuff.
No.
Personally, but some of those late night shows were so bonkers, whether it was obviously the DCM kind of setting the bar for the year of how nuts is this going to get. But even there, I remember seeing John Daly and Brett Gelman used to do rap duo called Cracked Out that was kind of like filthy, aggressive hip hop.
Yeah.
There was a night they had a late night show, and this was at the 26th Street Theater, and there was a blackout. Like all the lights in the theater turned off, and me and someone else ran around to all the different bodegas in the area and bought a bunch of Jesus candles and came back, and the show was like still going on in the dark, and then it's me and someone else lighting candles, and I wasn't even interning or working that night. It was like, oh, let me just go. I guess we're doing, and then we're like lighting Jesus candles while they're doing filthy raps, and Jason Mantzoukas is like literally dressed as Osama bin Laden being their hype man. God. And it's just one of those things where I look back and I'm like a 44-year-old dad now, and I'm like, oh, I was around for some shit that was undeniably wild in its time. Like it was just undeniably some of the wildest shit happening in a city like New York. It was real lucky, right time, right place stuff.
And part of the wondrous magic of improv is the ephemeral nature, the being in the moment with an audience, like the fact that, you know, because they weren't doing a scripted show, well, now the show becomes We Are in the Dark. And now you are part of the show lighting candles. Like it reminds me of those, you know, you hear stories about 60s happenings or like environmental theater, you know, Richard Schechner directing a thing where the audience members end up going home in cabs with the cast members and like dating them, you know, just these weird amorphous, anything can happen nights.
And it wasn't like, I don't want to overblow the legend of old UCB. There were a lot of really terrible things too.
Sure.
A lot of things that were a complete waste of time, a complete snooze. But a lot of things that, you know, you'd kind of go to a lot of the things that were bad. And with a batting average that is impressive, more often than you thought, you would also see something where you'd go, this is the most fucked up or brilliant or daring thing I've seen, and it's free or $5. There's also a summer at 22nd Street where Susie, when I was so young that when I used to intern on Saturday nights, I have not thought of this in many years. There was a summer where the air conditioner broke that cooled down the theater. And it was a former strip club. I was so little that the manager would bring me in the back and we'd climb up the fire escape, and he would remove the top of the industrial air conditioner and hold me by my legs. This is not a joke.
No. Oh
and
my God.
Dangle me over my waist, and I would restart the fan blade with my hand. And when we heard it, he would yank me up and out of this giant piece of, like, literal, like old school child labor, dangling you inside a piece of machinery.
Like you're a chimney sweep.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Restarting it by hand. And then it totally crapped out. And that summer got wild because they didn't stop doing shows. So you would sometimes see a show, and when the crowd got up to leave, there was like a literal cloud of body odor and sweat. And people would be almost in this like hazy, sweated out, like
a steam room.
Almost like you're watching comedy in a steam room, but like everyone's sort of feeling like they're hallucinating. You look back, you're like, man, thank God I was a part of something that interesting.
Yeah.
Like my life could have gone in so many directions that were not that interesting.
Yeah. Do you feel like does that scratch an itch now, being able to look back and know that you had a chapter that was so adventurous and so full of life, now that you are, you know, raising a kid and living a more suburban existence? Does that kind of feed you to have those things to look back on?
It definitely, I mean, the chance to sit down and talk with you is very exciting. As a 44-year-old boring dad in the suburbs of New Jersey, I'm like, yeah, let's relive this stuff. Let's recognize it was cool. I absolutely miss it. I try not to overblow the fact that, like, you know, you watched the history of UCB and you saw this thing where everything got consistently better, but you maybe stopped seeing the stuff that was like mind-bendingly straight, like, you know, like everything kind of got into this middle ground where everything was undeniably better on average, but it was homogenized. Like, I don't want to romanticize it too much, but god damn, I feel lucky I was there. Let alone, like, also then being able to like drive back to my college short form group and be like, guys, I just took a class on Sunday and I'm learning all this stuff and I can try to like pass it on to you. And then had that dual thing of like in over my head completely in New York City and then driving the hour back to Rutgers and being like, I get to help also now pass this on, and that helps make you better at it. And that was like a solid 2 year. My first 2 years at UCB, I was still a college kid.
Yeah. Do you remember this might be a stretch, but any specific things that were those keystones that you were bringing back to your fellows, like key lessons, or what were you bringing back?
I think first of all, just in general, long form was really new on the East Coast. I do think I got there pretty quickly after. I mean, there were some long form groups in New York that predated UCB, and then you hear about some where you go, oh, they were actually tied in with like Scientology and recruiting people into a religion. You go, what is going on? And a lot of short form stuff, but not much long form. So just in general, to go like, hey, guys, we're doing shows that are pretty much just like we watch Whose Line Is It Anyway and pick our favorite games and play them. To come back and go like, hey, if anybody else wants to make the 45-minute drive, there's something crazy happening. Yeah. And like you're learning this on almost like a more intrinsic muscle memory, human psychology. Like it's not games. It's real deep connect with each other and execute ideas. Like this is next level. And my college group, looking back on it, for a late 90s, early 2000s college group, like it was me, just the people may have heard of, like Jamie Rivera, who's still a teacher at the Magnet in Second City, New York today. Liz Bolton was a teacher at the Groundlings. Katie Dippold, who I think a lot of people listening to this don't need an intro. Tarek Davis, who you might know from Boom.
We did Boom together.
We were all in the same college group. Like that's
wow.
Like a bunch of us who still 20, 30 years later are still pretty deep in it. And I think a part of that, there was another improv group from Montclair State. And we were like the two college groups close enough to UCB in New York that we kind of showed up and we were known as the Rutgers kids. Like it was a known thing. And there were 4 or 5 other people too who haven't stuck with it, who were also all great. So we got to almost learn about long form in the moment. And a bunch of us, me, Jamie, Katie, Tarek, all started taking classes. And then we'd come back with our little short form group, and it was all of a sudden on campus, we became like superheroes.
That's awesome.
So you can imagine our college shows, all of a sudden people were like, the fuck is going on? And it's like, well, we're all taking classes with like Ian Roberts, and it's like we just got introduced to steroids.
Right.
Last semester we were doing I'll put my hands in your armpits, and this semester we're doing like 40-minute long movies,
Right. It's like Time Bandits, where they like push the wall and end up in a different dimension. Like you guys broke through and are like, hey, but come through this wall and check this out.
It was weird. On campus, our college group, all of a sudden, every show was like, no one could get a ticket because people were like, these guys really leveled up. And it's like, oh, well, we all have secretly been taking the train once a week and relentlessly absorbing this stuff as best we can.
What's interesting to me about that is I think that speaks to what a talented bunch you all were, which is an accident of fate or just, chaos. But that you were selling out shows and the audiences were thrilled with what you were doing. I think that's like more of a 1% experience. Like most often when kids are like, now we'll try long form, it's so haphazard and clunky, and they're trying, but it takes a while usually to learn those skills and integrate them. So it's impressive that you were able to level up in a way that was received well by an audience, and
to be certain, like it was clunky. Like we weren't TJ and Dave out there, but you just think like one of the things that I do still obsess so hard over with improv is it's not even 100 years old. Like it's not even been 100 years since Viola Spolin started writing down theater games.
Yeah.
Like, so you think about the fact that 25 years ago, there were a group of kids who, we we happened to be talented, and we also happened to live off of a train line where you could get on a train and it would drop you 9 blocks from the UCB theater right after it opened in New York. Like, that is both the talent and the luck of living where we did, and some of us being able to go, like, you know, I am going to work a part-time job specifically to pay for a class, and like, I will drink less booze this week to make sure I have money for the train ticket to go take my class on Sunday. And then, yeah, like, me and Jamie took that level 1 class together. John Bowie snuck him in too, which I don't always tell people. And then our level 1 class, we'd go. MC Chris, the nerdcore rapper, he was in our level 1 class before he blew up. And we'd take our class from 3 to 6. We'd go and buy 40s and drink them in a parking lot on 22nd Street because I was
before
19.
Class?
No, after class.
Oh, after class.
And then if we could, MC Chris would try to sweet talk. Seth Morris, I think, used to manage on Sunday nights, and MC Chris would be like, just sneak us into the first Ask Cat. And if we could get into the first one, we would, and if not, we'd wait for the second one and just be like blind drunk on malt liquor, drinking in a New York City parking lot, waiting for the show to start. That's
amazing.
Beautiful. It was beautiful.
Your improv is so good. Obviously, you're one of the.
Thank you. I feel the same way about you.
Oh, geez, that's hard to receive, but you're one of those players that you're so consistent, and you're also so you. And I think a hallmark of your style or your voice as an improviser is like total commitment. You're never wavering, but it's not like goofy, clowny, big, muggy commitment. It's like you are drilled into the center of the floor and like listening so hard, and you're so grounded and you play so real. Where does that come from? How long did that take to develop? Yeah.
Well, I can tell you the honest answer, and it's going to sound negative at first, but it actually taught me how to bring that to the table. Is from a pretty young age, I got very used to the idea that I was never going to be the funniest one on stage at UCB, while being, at times, a pretty cocky 21, 22-year-old kid who was getting a lot of praise. Like, I was still kind of cocky, but I got put on my first Herald team, and within a year we broke up, and I got added to a team with Brian Husky, Seth Morris, and Rob Corddry. I was 21 years old. And then Corddry left because he got cast on The Daily Show, which was like, what is happening? And he got replaced by Jack McBrayer, who had just moved from Chicago. I'm 21 years old. And those guys looked out for me so hard. Also, I mean, Shannon O'Neill on that team, Rhea Dates, a bunch of people who are just like balls to the wall funny. And I look at my history with improv and I go, there were a couple times where I wound up on teams where I was the veteran, but more often than not, on my way up, I would get added to these notable teams and I would feel like I was drowning, even though I knew I was pretty good. Like, I wound up on this, Billy Merritt put together this group. It was very Billy. It was called the Sunshine Gang, the WPA theater project, where Billy was like, I want to do a show that presupposes that it's the Great Depression and we travel to work camps putting on shows called Make-em-ups. But it was Billy, Brian Husky, Chad Carter, and a very young me. And I'm like, man, I am not as smart as Chad. I cannot fill up the room with the charisma and love that Billy does. Brian Husky is one of the world's best character actors, and I knew it when I was young. I'm like, what do I do? You know, I was on a group that, one of my favorite groups I ever performed in was called Five Dudes, which, you know, today you probably wouldn't even form a group called Five Dudes, but those 5 dudes were Bobby Moynihan, Zach Woods, Eugene Cordero, Charlie Sanders, and me.
Yeah.
I wound up on the Stepfathers with Bobby Moynihan. He gets cast on SNL off of the Stepfathers. Zach Woods gets cast on The Office off of the Stepfathers. And everyone in New York knew those guys were going to blow. Like, I'm doing Ask Cat. When I first get invited to do it, Amy Poehler tells me come by on Oscar night and Super Bowl Sunday. My first 2 years was like, here's the Sundays that no one else wants to do. And then she was like, start coming by. And I would drop in once in a while. And she was like, I don't get why you're not coming more. And I was like, I didn't think you were serious. She's like, you can come every week. And
to play? Like to sit in with them?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And this was like 2007, 2008. So I'm 7 or 8 years in at UCB. And I'm telling you, it is not an exaggeration to say that very often those shows would be Amy, Seth Meyers, Jason Sudeikis, Jack McBrayer, John Lutz, John Glazer, Brian Stack, Rachel Dratch, Horatio Sands. Like, this is the people I'm up there with. And usually in that era, the only 2 UCB regulars that weren't TV people were Jason Mantzoukas and me. So even the other UCB guy is a guy who I look at him and I'm like, how the fuck do you keep up on a stage like that? Like, how do I go up with the Stepfathers on Friday night when Bobby and Zach are going to crush everything they say? How do I do the 5 dude shows when it's like, I mean, I invite anybody to try to keep up with the combo of Bobby, Charlie Sanders, Eugene Corzero, and Zach Woods. Like, just try to keep up. So
how did you? And how did you manage go ahead, sorry.
I learned how to do what you said, which is I realized at a certain point, like, and these guys, it would kill them to hear this, but like, I would be in therapy. In 2007, I was having a really bad year. I wound up back in therapy. And I remember saying to my shrink, like, Bobby and Zach are 2 of my best friends, and I feel like I can't get a word in edgewise, and I don't know what to, and I'm like freaking out about improv, which is silly looking back on it. But I remember my shrink kind of helping me realize, like, well, what do you have that they don't have? And I sort of realized, for some reason, out of all the improvisers of my era, I was willing to get way more personal. I was willing to very clearly have elements of myself show up in my characters. I was very willing and ASCAT to step up and tell a story that felt very real or very raw. And I started to realize, like, I'm pretty funny. Like, I'm not trying to be overly modest. Like, there have been other situations where I'm not swallowed up on stage, but like, you're not going to fight through an ASCAT when it's Sudeikis and John Lutz. Like, get out of the way or learn to help them. And the thing you can do to help them is always be the one that can keep this show on the rails, that can keep it moving forward. Be the person who learns how to make those moves that like structure the show in a cool way. Learn how to make sure that, like, if they say something right now in minute 3 of the show, that you're the person in minute 25 that sees that callback coming, and gain that reputation that, like, if I tag you out while you're cooking, they're trusting, oh shit, Gethard sees the chess move that we don't see yet, follow him. So, you know, not to pat myself on the back too hard, but I think I became an extraordinarily good point guard. I learned how to pass the ball. I learned how to do the fancy no-look passes. I learned how to, do that. And, who cares about legacy? But I do sometimes think back to this stretch of UCB and I go, I don't think anybody's going to put me in the top 10 pound for pound funniest list of the people who were around watching shows back then. But if you ask those pound for pound people on the top 10 list, a lot of people would make, who's your favorite person to be on stage with? I think I show up on their lists. I think a lot of the funniest people trusted me on stage as someone who could ground things, make it feel real, could let them go ape shit and reel back in the comedy. By being like, you can just go and be nuts and funny and not think about it. I'll hold the goddamn show together. And that's a value thing for those funny people,
100%. Yeah, you're the glue guy. And from an audience standpoint, like, I've never seen you waver. Like, you're one of the most consistent, dependable players I've ever seen, where, like, even if a scene isn't getting laughs, doesn't matter. You are so in that character, in that world. You're serving whatever the thing that you are building is, and you're there hammering the nails in to make it work and hold so that later something can pay off,
I came to love, I sort of maybe resented that at times as there was a dialogue around UCB New York at a certain point, and it corrected, and I'm lucky it did. There was certainly a dialogue of, I guess, I got a sitcom in 2010, and I will never forget a student coming up to me and being like, I know people who have quit because if you've been doing this for 10 years and can't get a job, it doesn't feel like they can. Like I know people quit because you were becoming a cautionary tale 10 years in.
Oh God.
So there were times I was stressed out, but I look back at the skills it gave me and I'm like, I think I can be silly and funny when I have to be, but I think the really silly, really funny people might look for me first. And that's like, I was listening to your episode with Eugene Cordero and I'm sitting there and I go, I don't think I've ever told Eugene this, but probably my favorite person ever to be on stage with.
Yeah.
Because just a manic puppy level of spreading joy and doesn't care about the rules. And hearing him explain it on your podcast, I'm like, oh, Eugene and I never had a full-fledged conversation, but he and I did some scenes together that I never, ever forgot. Because I'm like, you just go be the funniest, most charming motherfucker anyone has ever seen. And I'll make sure the show holds together. Mm-hmm. And then we'll go out and get food and talk. And it'll be awesome. And I'd specifically, Eugene will tell you, if he ever hears this, he's giggling because he knows I'm talking about a specific scene called the ping pong tub, which is, you can imagine, is a perfect Eugene Cordero scene. Uh-huh. But when I tell you, like, he and I could do like a 15-minute long scene where the game is, you sometimes need to just sit in this tub and play ping pong while you're sitting in a tub. And I'm like, you can go ping pong tub and they'll buy it. And I can make that last 15 minutes. And that's pretty magical when you put it together, you know?
One of my favorite things is looking in old coaching notebooks, because like often I'll just like title the scenes and it's, you know, it'll be like Nazi balloon, lobster mittens, ping pong tub, you know, it's like I don't remember what those scenes were now.
If someone found one of your old notebooks, how fast do you think they call the FBI? Like if they just find it on the ground.
Immediately. Yeah, you're
real
on
Unabomber.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I want to ask, as you were progressing through classes and through the early learnings, early experiences, did you take to the lessons right away? Did game feel easy for you? What felt easy or hard, and what was your journey like?
I took to it like a depressed college kid who needed happiness in his life. So I was all in. You know, I was all in. I think I did start to pick up on it relatively quick. It was also an era where I remember some of the older performers when I got there expressing like, this kid's already done short form in college. Like, oh man, we're screwed. Like there was kind of this like, whereas now you think of UCB and you're like, probably most of the people signing up did like theater camp and improv in high school and ran their college improv group, and then were the best improviser in Seattle for 4 years before even moving to New York or LA.
Right.
But I was a rarity in that I knew how to be on stage and chase the funny moment because I had done a year or so of short form heading into it. It was all I ever thought about. So I did soak up the lessons. As far as game goes, I do think I took to it pretty well. I think I also am partially responsible. You know, I worked at the UCB school and helped write the first drafts of most of their curriculums. Like I helped.
Really?
Yeah, I helped codify the written down version of that and sometimes have regrets about that.
Like what?
Well, I think I don't have regrets in the sense that UCB was growing to a massive level and needed quality control. You needed to make sure that if you took a level 3 class with one teacher, you were getting remotely the same thing as another teacher. And that was not the case. And I was always kind of in this position in UCB New York, I think, where I was viewed as like the kid brother of the first generation and then a pretty trusted guy to the people who came after me. I was always in the, so I was, they kind of, I think, accurately were like, you are a guy who can help clean up our system, make sure the teachers are good, make sure that there's a curriculum that makes sense. That being said, I oftentimes wonder if I wrote a bunch of documents that firmed things up to a degree that it eventually maybe hardened into a system that I would not have signed up for at the age of 20 as like a fucked up punk rock kid. Like I may personally be sort of responsible for helping to de-punk rockify the UCB classes in a way that I sit there, I go, it was necessary, but it does bum me out that I wrote it all down. I think also being in that position where I knew if I want to contribute in shows, I have to do all the things that aren't the jokes really helped me learn it. But on the way up in classes, I was all about it. And I always felt like game became this thing that everyone reacts to about UCB, for better or for worse. But at the end of the day, I just sit here and I go, it's just people saying, what's funny about your comedy scene? Mm-hmm. And you should be able to answer that in a sentence or two. Yeah. And if it takes more than a sentence or two, it's probably muddled up. And if there's more than one answer, you're probably doing more work than you have to. You know, like, I think that's a pretty simple way to think of it. And I think a lot of people who love game would go, pretty accurate. Yeah. It's also a thing where, like, it's not, I don't think that's a headache or intimidating or turns you robotic to just think about, if you're doing comedy, you should be able to say, what was funny about that? What were you going for? And you should be able to go, cool, we were blah, blah, blah. And that's your game. Play it,
you know? Choose a take or be tickled and now share what tickled you with the audience who's like waiting hungry to be tickled and wants to see what your comedic brain sees that they don't see. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know when I was teaching, I think I got there were definitely times where I fueled. There was a little bit of a legend of Gethard classes at some point. I fueled that. Then I realized I don't want to be a guru guy. But I think that there was a stretch where I was pretty beloved. And I think a lot of it is because I'm like, I think I'm pretty able to explain game in a way that's like not intimidating and makes sense. Because I have had to be up there with people where if I can't quickly gauge what the game is, they are going to leave me in the goddamn dust. So I just learned that was like a razor sharp instinct of mine.
Sink or swim. Yeah. What would you do differently now if you got given the pen to write the curriculum and did it all over?
Well, what I realized at a certain point as a teacher, because it's funny because I look back and I go, and this is probably shitty of me, I kind of codified the system. Me and Anthony King. Anthony wrote the level 1 curriculum. I wrote the 2, 3, and 4. He did multiple drafts after that, but he and I kind of teamed up on that. And he's brilliant. He's like a brilliant genius, and a lot of us owe our careers to Anthony King. Yeah.
But famously, then the author and creator of the Beetlejuice Broadway musical and Gutenberg the musical,
and the longtime artistic director of UCB, he certainly helped me, and I watched him with many others go like, cool, here's what's special about you. Mm-hmm. I'm going to carve out some oxygen for you at this theater. Go get it. And if you followed his game, if he had a game plan for you and you followed it, you were going to be in pretty good shape, is one thing I learned about Anthony King. Brilliant guy.
While being so humble and so kind and gentle and, just a wonderful person.
And great on stage in his own right.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. A guy who I actually coached before he ever took a class at UCB. I was coaching him.
That's so funny.
And I remember he always gives me credit because I remember coaching him and I was like, what level are you at? And he's like, I haven't started level 1 yet. I just know these friends from North Carolina. So they invited me to their practice group. And I was like, okay, when people find out about you, they're going to flip out and they're going to treat you like the great hope and like, just keep trying to get better and try to ignore that buzz because it's going to come hard and fast for you. And he always was like, and it did. And I was able to remember you saying that and remember like people were blowing a lot of smoke and it's a nice feeling, Anthony, but just like when I was 19, I got that treatment a little bit as well, being this kid. And you're going to be this person where people go, how are you this good pre-level 1? You will serve yourself well if you just put your head down and keep moving forward. And I felt like Anthony and we always had a real trust and appreciation for each other. But I at a certain point then turned around and became the teacher that was like, fuck the curriculums. Like what the curriculums don't have in them is the central question of, so what do you do with all this stuff once you get good at it? Yeah. And that was a flaw in something I wrote. And then I kind of became known as this rabble-rouser teacher for a while. That was like, a lot of the people signing up for my classes, I realized were people who were like recently cut from Herald teams, who felt restricted and felt like that was a grind, like a meat grind they got put through. And like, how long do I have to do pattern games? And how long am I going to get yelled at about, was that time dash or analogous? And I'm not nailing it in the scientific way. And I remember teaching some classes where I remember once very specifically who it was, I won't say, but this student I really liked. I'm like, why'd you pick that idea off the opening? Well, I felt like if I combined this and this, it could lead to this. Okay, why'd you pick this? Oh, well, I felt like, okay, they had mentioned this, and if I picked a character that played into this, they might realize this. And I was like, are any of you picking your ideas because you think they're the most interesting ideas or they're the funniest ideas? It's just becoming a lot of A plus B should lead to C. And I started to realize that I helped codify that, but that there was a major flaw in the very idea of writing all this stuff down. And yes, the quality control meant that the average was higher, but it raised the floor while also putting a ceiling on it.
Yeah.
And then I, as a teacher, tried to really adjust by really trying to destroy that idea of a ceiling of what this could be. And I wound up teaching some very crazy classes to maybe erase some of my guilt for codifying the system.
Well, I mean, first of all, remove that guilt because, you know, you're just the scribe. I mean, I don't mean to minimize what you did, but like just the act of writing anything down has that restrictive effect, because now people who are reading it and buying it are looking at hard, cold words on a page that has a finite amount of paragraphs. I think psychologically something happens where you go, well, these are what's allowed and this is how to do it because this is the list that I'm reading on a page. And it limits, it's so two-dimensional and it's left brain. Like reading is a left brain process. Improvising is a right brain process. There's a little left brain in there. But I think like I would absolve you of any guilt that you have for doing it. It's like not that okay.
I don't think about it too often, but I do some. You know, a lot of people I think look at UCB New York in particular and go, okay, and it's relaunched now in a way that I think is great, which allows us to start talking about this a little publicly as community members, because the relaunch seems really, really healthy and great, but I do think a lot of people showed up in New York after a certain point and went, I heard this was like the nutso creative temple of comedy, and I feel like what I'm getting are a lot of rules. You know, I think that became a dialogue. Some of that was probably overblown. Some of that was not. And I do think a lot about, you know, what happened and what are the cautionary aspects of that, and how do you keep a theater that's growing exponentially in reputation, in influence, in size? How do you keep that growth healthy? How do you let go of the punk rock past as it's becoming clear that that's not totally the reality of the present? Like, how do you stop those things from getting tangled up? How do you just keep it a healthier place? It is something that I think people are so much more mindful of now. And I have really, really high hopes that the relaunch in New York is going to be great, because I think there were a lot of lessons learned.
Yeah. Do you still play there? What's your show life now? I know that you're raising a family.
I'm raising a family. I did the Chris Gethard Show, which was kind of I really stopped performing at UCB heavily around 2013. I'd been there for 13 years. Wound up doing the public access show, which I would argue, if you go and watch my old TV show, that's one of the closest things to a late night UCB show you'll see that actually made it onto the airwaves. Like, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty nuts in a way that is really similar to the old UCB vibe.
Let's pause here. Talk to me about the genesis of that show and how it came to life.
It started largely because of Anthony King. I had started telling a lot of stories on stage, and people started going, oh, this dude's getting very real when he has a moment to be himself. And Mike Birbiglia actually told me, he was like, out of that early wave of UCB, he's like, everyone who you've heard of, you generally know them because of roles they've played or shows they've written on. He's like, you're kind of the early UCB guy that people just know for being you. Like, You're not, you know, Bobby's drunk uncle. Zach is Gabe from The Office. Like, you're just Gethard. And like, how'd that happen? So Anthony started to notice my comfort with that. And I also started staging some more performance arty feeling things. A lot of that, weirdly enough, driven my senior year of college. I took a modern dance class with a maniac for a teacher. And it was actually, I look back, weirdly influential on my comedy. Because he was very into this idea of like, cool, we're going to leave the space and let's go out in the streets and like surround a car and just see what happens. Or like we'll all stand over here on this hill that overlooks a bus stop, and one at a time you will go stand next to someone and mimic all of their movements next to them. And if they ask you what you're doing, just don't answer. Like, he was very clearly a bored, tenured professor doing some performance art stuff with a joke senior. It was all seniors taking this modern dance class. But I started doing weirdo stuff at UCB because I found it very exciting.
Is that what kind of fed some of the inspiration for Jump on 3 and the sort of like doing shows in weird spaces that you guys were doing?
I coached a group called Dreadnought. Don Finelli from Dreadnought coached Jump on 3, so they were kind of like my grandbabies on the family tree. And Dreadnought, famously, this maniac one day came up to me at UCB and he's like, Chris, I've seen you a few times and I think you're really special. I think you're great up there. I was like, oh, thanks so much. That's super nice. And he's like, I want you to leave UCB. And I was like, why? And he's like, I run a sushi restaurant on 23rd Street, 3 blocks away, 23rd and 8th. And he's like, I'm booking entertainment there, and I know UCB doesn't pay you, and I'll pay you. And I was like, totally respectfully, I'm not going to leave the hottest comedy theater in America to come perform at a sushi restaurant. But I have a group of students that is ready to go. So Dreadnought was Don Finelli, Michael Caine, Catherine Mudon, Noah Foreman, Dom Manzalillo, and I am forgetting somebody who I feel really bad about. Really good people. And they went and performed at this sushi restaurant. And a bunch of UCB people showed up just purely to be like, the fuck are you talking about? You're performing at a sushi restaurant.
This? Yeah.
But also there was no stage and they didn't put up any signage. And there was a very crowded, like it was dinner time in Chelsea. And all these people just trying to eat sushi. And then my students started doing improv. And when I tell you that I've like never been more proud as a teacher, God damn, that was true. And they just sort of disrupted a sushi restaurant and put on a show and started, like, people would yell at them. I remember at one point Don actually like left the restaurant with a woman who was just eating there and I think took her like on a date, walking around the block, getting to know her. The whole thing was very strange. People were talking about it. And then, Don kind of took a lot of that, spread it out to Jump on 3. Then I taught a class called Parentheses that was 27 of the best people at the theater at the time. Dreadnought, Jump on 3, and a bunch of people kind of from their generations that was just, let's do tons of weird shit. Mm-hmm. But Anthony, it was really fun. And Anthony was the one along the way. I started doing the Gethard Show around the same time. Anthony King was like, I went to him, I had been doing a storytelling show, and it was selling tickets. I was like, I've always wanted to host a talk show. And he's like, look, I like it. He's like, everybody at some point puts on a suit, does monologue jokes. Anybody who pitches me a talk show, it's just they're doing Letterman and Conan. He's like, you're doing all this weird shit with your classes, with some of the shows. I had a show where a bunch of us paired off and boxed each other. We rented a warehouse and we actually boxed with like a referee. And then we screened the boxing matches and it sold out. Amy Poehler showed up and it was like a bunch of us punching each other in the face on film. And we were all like, holy shit, Amy's here. It was like before I knew her. Not that there was a stretch where we knew we were tight from ASCAP, but like it was weird. I did a bunch of shows where people are getting shot with paintball guns on stage. And Anthony was like, if you're going to do a talk show, just don't make it like you put on a suit and do a Letterman impression. Let it just be, I'll give you once a month and do all your weird shit. Mm-hmm. And that combination of working with Dreadnought, Jump on 3, which was J.D. Amato. He became the showrunner of my show for 3 years on cable. Drew Johnston and Noah Foreman wrote every episode from public access through our whole cable run. Nicole Drespel was in that Parentheses class. Jackie Jennings, they were both in Parentheses. I gave them writing jobs. Phil Jackson was a huge part of the Parentheses show. Don Finelli helped, the Gethard Show. Don Finelli helped build it from its earliest days. Just, I also hit a point at UCB where I realized I don't like the idea. Like, if I meet students and they're super fucking funny, I want to work with them. I don't think that anybody should have to wait in line for stage time as hard as you do, especially because UCB New York, if we're being honest, a lot of people would get put on those weekend teams and go, cool, I never need to rehearse again or never need to get a note again. And I certainly was cut from that cloth, but I always was like, I don't want to just never push myself again.
Yeah.
And in fact, I want to work with the people who are in the rhythm of pushing themselves and getting pushed and pushing each other. And that's not necessarily the veteran vibe. The veteran vibe is a little bit more, we can take it easy now. I don't want to take it easy. And maybe there's some arrogance to that or some ego to that, but those things all mixed together in this stretch of teaching and doing the Gethard Show for me, that was life-changing.
It sounds to me like the opposite of arrogance. It's like you still see that you have work to do and ways that you can discover and get better. That's how it hits me. Yeah.
For sure. To be fair, if you ask members of the Stepfathers who were on that team with me around 2009, 2010, 2011, they will tell you I was also a huge fucking pain in the ass at times. Admittedly, a big pain in the ass. About like, we need to get notes, we need to do this and that, and other people being like, you got to meet us where we're at. Maybe we can, you know, I was a pain.
Taking it so seriously.
And when I tell you that, like Will Hines and I at times got in literal shouting matches on my front steps about my attitude, like, and he was correct. Like Will gave it to me a couple times. But you know what else, Susie, is I also look back and go, my performing life was inching more towards storytelling and doing a thing called the Chris Gethard Show. And I think I made a huge mistake back then, which was, it's very hard to turn off. If you're doing the Chris Gethard Show on Wednesday nights where you get to make every decision and things that fail are your fault and you better be micromanaging about them, it's hard to go do the Stepfathers on a Friday night and Ask Cat on a Sunday night and fully turn that off. And I think it took me a little too long to realize that I was perhaps being a little bit of a know-it-all and a little bit of a dickhead. And that the issue wasn't that I was a bad person. The issue was that I wasn't realizing that the whole context was shifting. Yeah. That it was time for me to go for it in a different way. And that, especially for someone who I think my reputation was always like, you're the grounded team player on an improv stage, that is not going to fit when life becomes more about the Chris Gethard Show.
Yeah, interesting.
You know?
Yeah.
And I had to admit that. And I burned a couple bridges because of that.
Man, that's tough. Bridges that remain burned, or...
One teammate of mine from back then who we just kind of stopped talking, and we were never we were always great on stage together, never the tightest of friends, but definitely an email that went out that was like, Chris, you're not, like, no one has made you the captain of the team. You got to chill out. And me going, oh, right. It was one of the things that kind of frayed our relationship in a way I don't love, but where I realized, I'm now, momentum is building with me where I am very often the captain of the team.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm being a dickhead. It's that I'm not recognizing that that's kind of fundamentally changing me. And I got to step back from the things that aren't that, because, you know, as we talk it out loud, I'm like, there were also probably many years there where I was craving that ability to go, how do I lead the charge on a thing when I'm up here with all these funny people? When that chance finally came, I had to sort of break off from improv and even UCB and go do the Chris Gethard Show on public access, which was this weird sort of satellite, like I dragged a lot of the UCB weirdos with me over there.
And was it... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Was it was literally on public access?
Yeah.
That's wild.
It was a monthly show at UCB for about 2 years, and it was, you couldn't get a seat. It was nuts. It was hugely flattering. One Saturday a month at midnight. And I mean, they would put it up, it would sell out. It was really, really incredible. And then we switched it in 2011 to public access. which was nuts. And then that attracted a cult following. And we did that, I think, until 2015 or 16. We got picked up by a cable network.
And where would you shoot that?
At the Public Access Studio on 59th Street, Manhattan. Yeah, it was, and it was nuts. It was the
what was
best.
that like? What?
Oh, maniacs, people who started, people who would show up and like, first of all, a lot of loving people, a true free speech institution, a thing that I think is vital and awesome and rad. I love public access TV, but no shortage of like, there was literally people who got banned from the studio for threatening us, saying we were Hollywood interlopers, claiming that I had called in my, quote, Jewish agents to pull strings and chase out other public access people. Like,
wow.
Actual conspiracy theorists who did conspiracy theory public access shows who viewed us as their enemy.
It's like immersive 4chan.
It was like being in the middle.
The escape room. Yeah.
It was. I have some times where I would be put on email threads with hundreds of other public access TV people, where the email threads were just brutally talking shit about me, and then me replying all, because they never do the CC, never do the BCC, and having to say like, hey everybody, like by all means air it out, but just so you know, I'm on here, so if you want to say something about me, just understand I'm seeing it and I can take any hits. Like literally, I remember a woman who was saying my show had no place on a New York public access channel because it didn't tie into the culture of New York comedy. And when I looked up her show, the very first clip I found was her interviewing an admitted child molester about his ability to travel between dimensions and talk to angels. And then I'm like replying all, and I'm like, hey, Paula, I think comedy in New York, like the first stand-up clubs were in New York, comedy in New York, those cultures have been linked. I think there's a lot of the culture of New York that actually it's been kind of the hotbed of American comedy, in at least in the stand-up sense. Agree to disagree. That being said, I don't get what interviewing a convicted pedophile about talking to angels has to do with the culture of New York, but I do not begrudge your right to have a show on the public access network. And then all these other people writing back, please take me off this list. Chris, I am not one of these people. We like you. It was wild and so fun and so nuts. And sort of in so many ways, I look back and I go, it felt like how the 22nd Street UCB felt to me, except they also had cameras and mics and teleprompters and a call-in system and equipment for bands to come play and all this shit that I could never have afforded to rent. They just made it available for free.
That is so cool. So how do you apply to get that? Like, is it just you just send in a letter?
You take
a
couple of classes on how the equipment works. There was a UCB student named Keith Bethay who I had taught, really great guy, and he was like, do you know I work at the public access studio? And I was like, no. He's like, your show that you're doing, that would be a fantastic public access show. And I grew up, I really loved a lot of public access in New Jersey. And I was like, that's a great idea. I had been thinking of winding down the show at UCB. And I was like, also in 2010, I got cast as the lead on a sitcom, and it got a huge amount of press.
What was the sitcom?
It was called Big Lake. It was with Chris Parnell, Horatio Sands, produced by Will Ferrell and Adam McKay. Wow. Comedy Central's first sitcom. There was a New York Times profile on me that it titled, I'll never forget the headline. I believe it was The Unlikely Pressure of Being a Sitcom Star. That was like, hey, this guy, he's been going for 10 years in New York. If you're a New York comedy fan, you probably have heard of him, but on a national level, you have not. And here's what it's like I replaced John Heder. Napoleon Dynamite was supposed to be the star.
Wow.
And at the very last minute, he was no longer part of it. And they auditioned 10 people. 2 of us got callbacks, me and Matt Bronger. And then they were like, you're the star of a sitcom. You start on Thursday. And that was the thing where that student was like, I mean, I know people who have quit because they were watching you not make it. I remember Peter Gwynn and Peter Gross telling me in the ASCAD green room, they were like, we never wanted to bum you out, but we have been part of multiple conversations at the Colbert Report writers room where other people bring you up and go, why can't that guy get a fucking job? And like, we've had to sit there and you're our friend and we have to like look at each other and be like, God damn. Like, so that sitcom showed up in 2010 And I realized I no longer had the energy to do Stepfathers or AssCat, but I still did the Gethard Show once a month. And then the sitcom bombed so hard, and the press was so brutal, and the internet comments, you know, not to be melodramatic, but I'm like, thank God I was already in therapy, because I might not have survived what happened on the internet to be on a sitcom that bombed after all the press was, here's this kid coming out of nowhere. And I got so mad. Because I also was like, I didn't write the show. I didn't produce the show. They chose to put a laugh track on the show after it was all shot, and the director didn't cover for a laugh track. Like, but all the press is saying, hey, we know Chris Parnell. It's this guy that sucks. Like, this is the new guy that sucks. It was hard, man. Really, you know, reading comment, to be a kid who had gone through a lot of mental health shit and then reading multiple comments about, you're so bad, you should kill yourself, and me being like, holy shit, I was pissed. And when my friend sat me down and was like, you should make the Chris Gethard Show a public access show, I was like, the smart thing to do is move to LA. And my agents were telling me that, of like, look, this didn't go well, but you just started a sitcom. That means the next couple pilot seasons, we're going to be able to just get you in every door. Now's the time to go to LA. And I was like, fuck this. I don't even really watch sitcoms. This shit stings in a certain way, but I also find myself really not caring in another way. And the part of me that doesn't care about shitheads on the internet is also telling me that the good move is go on public access TV and make a thing where if people hate it, at least it's because it was yours. At least they will hate your idea. They won't be hating a show that you were a relatively small piece of the puzzle and blaming you for, and or mocking the size of your fucking forehead all over the internet. You know what I mean? Jesus. Like at least they'll be shitting on a thing you actually stand by. And I mean, I was hosting a public access show less than a year after getting cast on that sitcom. And there were people, I know for a fact, there's a friend of mine at UCB who we had made some videos together, who when JD Amato, when we started the public access show, I had taught him in parentheses. I was like, would you want to direct the show on public access? He was like, yeah. And he started gathering up people, and he went to another friend of ours, and the friend said, don't be a part of Gethard's breakdown. He's having a mental breakdown. Don't do it.
Oh, geez.
That was kind of the perception of it at the time in the community. To some, not to everybody, but to some.
Yeah. I a few years ago, you came out with a special where you talk very openly about mental health and depression and anxiety, and it was really powerful and resonated really hard with me, and I was really grateful that you spoke so candidly and vulnerably about it. How do you find it in yourself to move through those things and come back and be like, no, I am, you know, how do you not get crushed by the criticism and the disbelief of others and believe in yourself again?
It's not always easy. I'll also say, like, sometimes I'm a little disappointed in myself because at the age of 44, as a dad with a pretty chill life, I don't always have that fight left in me. Like, I feel like, oh, there was a stretch in my 20s and 30s where I was a fighter. I don't necessarily have it in me anymore. And also, like, I have a child and a wife, and their privacy now gets, like, I'm a more private person and a less bold person than I was a few years ago. But I'm glad I had a stretch where I was pretty bold. And a lot of it honestly goes back to improv. Like, I started improvising at 19. I didn't see a shrink until I was 23. And if you look in that 4-year gap, I was playing a lot of depressed characters well before I ever told anybody in my life, I think I have this thing called depression. Like, when I kind of inherently knew something really off about me. I'm having some very crazy thoughts at times, and I'm aware of that. The way I first dipped my toes into feeling safe putting that out there was through characters and improv scenes. And then that eventually turned into talking about it on stage as myself. In the context of maybe a storytelling show with 4 or 5 other people on stage. And then eventually as the ASCAP monologist, where a bunch of people are instantly going to turn it funny. And then eventually I can do this show that's pretty frank discussion of it without any of that. So, you know, comedy, Comedy really, I don't ever want to say comedy's therapy, but it was very therapeutic for me.
Yeah.
And in a growing up Irish Catholic, being of a certain age where I grew up in the 80s and 90s, this idea that you're going to just be like, I'm depressed, like the dialogue on that has changed pretty quickly, but it was not a comfortable thing to put out publicly for many, many years. And the empowerment of being on stage, starting as an improviser, is what got me there. Yeah.
I have said comedy is therapy, and I'm fine saying that it feels therapeutic, not only in the sense of funneling joy, play, and community into your life, which I think are therapeutic, but also serving as an outlet to kind of process. The Greeks used to do cathartic theater, like catharsis comes from theater, where they would, portray their demons in life, the person that treated them poorly, and they would play them, and it would release those emotions. And I've had that experience where I'm coaching and people do stretch and share, and then we do scenes off of their stretch and share. And it's like, this is literally like role play to kind of get this out of everyone's system.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is so special.
If I can slip a plug in, I actually, for 2 years, like my involvement in improv has kind of come back to life. And part of why I started listening to your podcast, I actually passed it along to my coworkers. I've been working at a nonprofit building a program where we send comedy workshops into schools, and we work with kids. We work with teachers to do exactly what you said, bring that sense of play back to life, get people comfortable inching into the spotlight, comfortable connecting with their peers. Like there's a part of me that is, sometimes I miss performing improv, but more often I miss teaching improv. And specifically when you see introverted people figure out how to channel something that they don't channel on their day-to-day, or seeing somebody who feels like clearly this is a person who hugs the wall, and by the end of week 8, they're not hugging the wall. They're like right in the gears of the class and how it's going. And, thinking back to that high school teacher who pulled me aside and was like, take my drama class. I'm now building this nonprofit where we've been doing it for 2 years and have taught over 7,000 people. And a lot of it goes right back to like that Spolin social work side of comedy, just like you're talking about. Like, yeah, it is cathartic. It is a tool for connection.
What's the organization called, or how do people connect?
It's called laughingtogether.org for all the info on it. And I knock on wood. I work super hard on it in the behind the scenes, and I've been teaching a lot for it, and I've got a lot of great teachers, and I'm hoping that it's just going to keep building and spreading, because I think the arts as an early intervention for kids who are troubled is really powerful, and comedy is the art that you don't need to buy an instrument or paints or brushes. Right. Like any kid can just roll out of bed and be a part of it. Doesn't matter their background. And it's a way to try to give back, as I'm a bit of an older man who wants to slow down. And it's been a really beautiful shift in my life to kind of get back to the very basics of what got me into improv in the first place.
I love that so much. If you ever scale it and bring it to LA, I'll be on the front lines as a teacher. I love that.
We'd be lucky to, I will follow up with you, because we would be lucky to have you.
Yeah, please.
And that's the end of Chris Gethard Part 1. For Part 2, become a subscriber at yesalso.supercast.com. If you like this podcast, you can support us and get a ton of bonus content over at yesalso.supercast.com. If you have a question about improv that you'd like us to answer on one of our future Q&A episodes, send it on over to yesalsopod@gmail.com. Remember to follow us on Instagram at yesalsopod, and keep sharing us with your improv communities. We love the love. If you're a theater who would like to host us for a live recording and improv show, let us know at yesalsopod@gmail.com. A huge shout out to Ryan Rosenberg, who produced this thing with his generous help and his unlimited knowledge about all things podcast. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week. No, we won't, Susie. That's not how podcasts work.
They will see. They won't even see us. They will listen to us. So it's actually the opposite of both things you said. Thanks for listening, and you will listen to us next week. Maybe. We don't know.